You might think of the medieval period as reserved and puritanical. But actually, medieval people had very different and more relaxed attitudes towards obscenity and sex than we do. As a result, in this episode, be prepared to hear a few harsh words and shocking truths.
When you think about the Tower of London and the medieval period more generally, pleasure probably isn't the first thing you think about. There's a couple reasons for this. First, we're taught that the Middle Ages is an unrelentingly grim time. Nothing but plagues, wars, and the church hiding under your bed to make sure that you don't have too much fun. And secondly, it's true that the church didn't want you to have a lot of fun, and a lot of the sources that survive to us from the medieval period specifically come from the Catholic Church. If you as a clergy member have to devote your life to piety and asceticism, you're probably not going to be encouraging your flock to have a lot of fun. In this series, we'll be uncovering the sumptuous world of medieval pleasure. From sex, to booze, to sport. We'll look at how people in the Middle Ages enjoyed themselves, and sometimes each other, starting with everyone's favorite subject, sex.
To start our exploration of medieval sex, I've headed to York, because it was one of the most important cities in medieval England. Rivaled only in size by London itself, York is a great place to understand what people were getting up to because, well, with this many people around, someone was having sex.
Because the Middle Ages is so long ago, the latest part is about 700 years in the past, it's really easy for us to forget that they were normal people too. We're here in the shambles in York, which is a great way to get a physical idea about the world of medieval pleasure. This would have been a thriving area of commerce, fun, booze, all kinds of options about how to have a fun time. This can help us to understand what it was like for our medieval ancestors when they went out looking for a bit of fun.
I met up with Dr. Kate Lister, an expert in the history of sex, to talk to her about where we might find clues about sex in medieval streets. One street in particular stands out as a testament to what people would get up to when looking for some fun.
So, Kate, you've taken me here to Grape Lane, and that is a kind of secret about what used to happen here, right?
Grape Lane is a contraction of Grap, which this street was originally recorded as being Grap Lane.
So are there other kind of similar names from around the time?
Yeah, there are. So there are Grape Lanes as original all over Britain. There was definitely one in Southwark, but there's also a record of Cock Lane, Horsmount. There's all kinds of sit-down hoe was one that's recorded as well. Medieval people didn't mess around when it came to naming your streets because you needed to know where to go.
In the medieval period, you got all these literal names about what you can buy there, like Milk Street, Poultry Street, and Grape Street. We tend to think about sex work as being this really modern invention, and not only is it quite a medieval institution, but it's really out in the open.
Oh, absolutely. It was as every part of York as much as the Minster and the cobbled streets, and that's true throughout the medieval world. They had a much more, I don't want to say laissez-faire because that's not true. They regulated it and controlled it, usually by zoning, which is what the names were about. So it was restricted to certain areas, but it was certainly very prevalent, very visible, whereas in our modern society it's kind of like this sort of open secret that it's kind of hidden away. We certainly don't have streets named after it, but we have areas that you can go to.
We tend to think, attitudes towards sex are always getting more open. How are attitudes towards sex different in the medieval period?
Just like our own time, there's not one distinct attitude. There's many, but you would probably be surprised if you were to go back in time to just how open and everyday this was. And I think the answer for that is because how are you going to make your money? It's a deeply patriarchal world now, let alone back in the Middle Ages. What job are you going to go into where you can make some serious dollar? It's really, really limited. And that doesn't mean that everybody turned to being on the game, but it was an option that you could make a lot of money in a short amount of time. And everybody knew about it as well. The authorities are going to tolerate it, but they need to be able to identify the people selling sex to differentiate them from good people. So you get all kinds of sumptuary laws and rulings, and it's normally things like they have to wear raid or striped hoods. So different things to different cities. Some of them were white and yellow, some of them were black, some of them were purple. In Vienna, they had to wear bells.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like they would literally be like jangling as they approached. But even that, it's horrendous that they're kind of marked out this way, but that often sort of became like a symbol of who they were. So if you're looking at the Viennese sex workers, they were required to wear all this stuff, and then they kind of made it like kitsch and sexy. Like they had these sort of great big poulant, like stiletto shoe platform things, and then it became something that the high class ladies started to imitate them. So as ever, they are trendsetters.
This is a great way to look at what ordinary women can do in cities, because you can't just go into a trade. And if you're a poor girl from off of the farm and you want to come to the big city, like this is one of the ways into a really lucrative career.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of options.
Right, absolutely. There are family trades that you could go into. There's big industries. I mean, I guess you could become a nun. You could marry. That was like really your goal as a woman, is when you wanted money, you'd have to marry it, which is sex work one man at a time, really, more than anything else. It's so frustrating because we don't have like the financial records of these women left to us. It's always like whispers and hints and stories and here and there. But there was a lot of money to be made. There absolutely was. And the kind of redemption arc that you see in a lot of medieval saints is testament to that. They generally don't start by going, she was on the game and absolutely hated it. It's generally like she had a really great shoe collection and then she found Christ.
Yeah.
That's kind of...
It busts one of the big myths about the medieval period, which is that people don't bathe.
They did bathe. Let's just put that one to bed. They were as conscious of smelling bad as you or I. They just didn't have the means to be having showers, hot showers every single day. But they worked around that by having public bathing and mixed communal bathing as well. So that's, that should also help to dispel the idea that they're quite prudish, because you just go into town and have a bath with your mates. I don't think I've ever had a bath with my mates. But obviously at the heart of that is the sex workers, because that's a really great place to find clients. And you can actually see that embedded in the language. A slang term for sex workers, I think it's concerned in the 14th century, was a lavender. That comes from the lavender that was used to fragrance the laundry houses and also the bath houses. That's how common it was. And there was association of laundresses with sex work, poor women who would, supplement their income that way. And the stews, which was another name for the brothel, that's linked directly to the bathhouses as well. Yeah, you'd go and stew in the water and it became known as a brothel. So it's absolutely at the heart of it.
So obviously here we are, place of commercial sex, but it's not like medieval people don't have regular flirtations and trying to get a hold of each other.
God, yeah, absolutely they did.
So I have gathered from Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love, several key medieval chat-up lines. And my challenge to you, Kate Lister, is to pick up a fine gentleman on the streets of York using only medieval pickup lines.
Armed with the most refined chat-up lines that Courtly Love has to offer, Kate was eager to try out her charms on York's unsuspecting suitors.
When the divine being made you, he left nothing undone.
Absolutely. That was good. That's good. That's a 4 or a 5 for me.
Good 3.5.
I appreciate
A
that.
hit!
Yeah.
Yes!
Yeah.
You must know that many days ago I was smitten with the arrow of your love, and that I tried with all my might to conceal the wound.
That's a 5. That's doing it for me, yeah.
I would say it's on top, but not quite.
Okay, all right.
To tell you the truth, I am an ambassador sent to you from the court of love.
Try again, buddy.
No, that's not doing it. I'm sorry.
So much nobility is apparent in you, and you are distinguished by so much courtesy, and believe in your presence. I may say that all those things that are lying in my heart waiting to be said.
4.5 to 5. I really like that. It feels sincere.
Yeah.
Very Valentine's-y.
Very
I
Valentine's-y,
do
right?
like it.
I'm not running screaming because clearly you don't know who I am if you think that I'm noble and courteous.
The Catholic Church quite literally towered over medieval cities like York, and it served as a constant physical reminder to everyone about how they should live their life in public and in private.
We're here at the York Minster, not just because it's a beautiful building, which it is, but because it's a great way to think about the physical presence that the church had on people's lives in the medieval period. Think about the fact that most people live in a building that's not even higher than 2 stories tall, and then what a huge building like this would mean in your life. So it's a physical reminder of what the church teaches about sexuality, as well as everything else. For medieval Christians, sex was a moral tightrope. Of course, everybody had to have sex, that's how you get children. But the church had long been of the opinion that any sex for anything other than procreation was a no. The church's position is that the only time sex is acceptable is between 2 married people for procreative purposes. And on top of that, there's a lot of other rules as well. No sex on Saturdays and Sundays in case you're too turned on during Mass. Only have sex in the missionary position because anything else subverts the natural relationship between men and women. Don't get fully naked during sex because it's just too exciting. In short, during sex, you should be trying to have the least amount of fun possible. The thing about all these rules, nobody really listened to them.
Perhaps surprisingly to our modern sensibilities, some of the biggest rule breakers could actually be found among the clergy.
We keep mentioning that sex is considered sinful by the Catholic Church. What are the theological reasons for that, you might ask? And there are several. Some of the oldest conceptions about this date to St. Augustine at the end of the antique period. He thinks very, very deeply about sex a lot of the time because he had a bunch of it before he joined the clergy himself. His idea about sex is this. Sex is very sinful because if we still lived in the Garden of Eden, if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen to original sin, when you wanted to have children, you would simply think about it. You would then simply insert tab A to slot B, decide now is the moment for conception, and it would happen. Boom, you got a baby. And you wouldn't feel anything about that at all. It wouldn't feel sexy, it wouldn't feel lustful, it wouldn't be pleasurable. You would only be doing it in order to have a kid. Fast forward to post the fall of man, and everyone is actually turned on when they want to have sex. And that's the thing that makes it sinful. It's absolutely fine to have a baby. The problem is liking the actual act of sex too much. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas then ranks sex in terms of how sinful it is. Sex is more sinful if it is more illogical, in his opinion. The most logical sex is sex between 2 married people who specifically want a baby. Nothing sinful about that. But it can become sinful if you're too turned on in the process. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas warns you that you shouldn't have too many lascivious kisses. You shouldn't be groping your partner too much. Ideally, you don't actually get naked and you wear some clothing during sex. Then forms of sex are ranked as less logical from there. So things that we don't necessarily consider as quote-unquote real sex, medieval people are actually more interested in. So things like manual sex or oral sex are technically sodomy. Sodomy is defined as any type of sex that cannot result in procreation. And it doesn't matter who is doing it. It doesn't matter if you are married to your wife and you're engaging in these acts. If it can't lead to a baby, then it's sinful. All of this is directly tied up with the idea that in the Garden of Eden, you wouldn't have any fun. So what is sinful about sex? Purely pleasure.
But, as we've already mentioned, not even the clergy always followed their own rules about sex. Some of my favorite references to the clergy behaving badly come from 14th century Prague.
There's a great document called the Archdiaconate Protocol where basically the church goes door to door to every church and asks parishioners, do you have any problems? And a lot of the parishioners in Prague say that they have problems specifically with sex and their priests. What kind of problems? Well, We've got priests who are living openly with concubines. There's one priest who is operating a brothel out of his own house that includes about 4 different women. There's a priest who sees a sex worker very, very regularly, and when he's confronted about it by the church, he says, well, yes, I see a sex worker, but I always pay her right away and make her leave immediately after. But probably my very favorite priest from Prague is one who gets caught in a brothel and wants to run away before he gets arrested. So he lights out of the house completely naked and runs down the streets of Prague, where all his parishioners see him. Imagine you're getting a lecture from the pulpit on a Sunday about all the sex you shouldn't be having, and you're getting it from the guy who you saw naked last night. These are the reasons why it makes it clear that nobody really necessarily cares what the church has to say about sex. If priests themselves can't follow the rules, why are the day-to-day lay members going to care?
If we want to get a better idea of people's sex life in the medieval period, it's helpful to have a look at some of the places that they would have been expected to do the deed. Because the bedrooms of everyday people during this period weren't exactly comfortable, and they certainly weren't private.
So one of the things that we need to know, first of all, is although there's just one bed here with us, in a servant's room that almost certainly wouldn't have been single occupancy, you would be sharing it. I guess sex was almost a public affair in the Middle Ages. Privacy would be a really, really rare commodity.
So say you have a dorm like this, probably, you're not going to be on the pole trying to bring a girl back to this sort of a situation, but it's not exactly unheard of either, is it?
Well, I mean, look, where are you going to go? Like, what are your options, right? There's nowhere to be hanging a tie on the door to say, don't come back. You're either going to take the chance and do it in shared rooms, or you're going to have to try and find sex outdoors, I suppose, or a quiet area somewhere.
And in a city like York, that's probably going to be a bit hard to come by.
It's going to be tricky. I mean, you find dark corners all over the place, but quiet, maybe not so much. So I suppose, yeah, you would be used to people having sex around you. Not constantly, but I mean, if you're growing up in a home and like where families were sharing one room, probably growing up and heard your parents have sex.
One of my favorite documents from the medieval period that talks about sex comes from a penitential, which is, a guidebook for priests to ask people in confession, have you done these bad sins? It's written by Bouchard of Worms. He's a bishop. He lives in the 8th century. He says that you should ask women, have you ever made an object in the shape and size to match your carnal desire? And have you ever taken the object, fastened it about your waist, and used it on another woman? So basically, have you ever made a dildo? And have you turned it into a strap-on and used it with other women?
See, you've just got to know where to look for this stuff. It's there.
Actual sexual objects or apparatuses left over from the medieval period are extremely rare. And this makes a lot of sense. By their very nature, these are the sorts of objects that are secretive, and they aren't exactly passed down from person to person. However, there are other resources that we can look at that might tell us more about medieval people's sex lives.
So we don't really have medieval objects, but we definitely do have medieval images of sex, right?
Someone had to have thought that it was worth saving to survive, basically. So we do have evidence of sex in like medieval manuscripts, for example, especially in the marginalia, the kind of little doodles.
Of course,
the slutty doodles all around the side, which has perplexed scholars ever since they were written. It's like, this is a really, really holy book, and here is a picture of women putting penises in a tree.
I love it.
Why is that doing that thing? We don't know, but that's good evidence. We also have surviving badges from pilgrimages.
Oh, I love pilgrim badges. A lot of them are sort of late medieval 15th century. They come from the lowlands. I've got a very, very favorite one, and it is a vulva that is wearing a crown, and she is being carried on a little litter by 3 phalluses who all have little legs and a tail.
And where did you go to get that badge? Wherever it was.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Because it shows us all kinds of different ways of relating to pilgrimage and the sex that you might be having on it. Because you might be having a lot of sex when you're on pilgrimage because you're under plenary indulgence. So that means that like any sins that you're doing, such as having sex,
Yeah.
will be forgiven. Or it might mean that people are hoping to, for example, cure something like impotence, or they're really hoping for fertility, and that's why they're going on holiday. But it certainly shows us that medieval people have this real sense of humor about sex, where they don't mind kind of showing off their interest in it.
Yeah, I know it's really difficult for us to look back and say this was exactly that because we don't have the context, but I can't look at those items and not think that there was humor in it. That they thought that was funny, that was something that they're playing about with it, even if it had a wider significance, like fertility. It was definitely having fun with it, definitely.
My big joke about being a sex historian is that I gossip about dead people's sex lives. So in that vein, what is your favorite piece of gossip about a dead person's sex life?
Since we're in York, there is one story that I remember about a man in York, and I think it was the 13th century, his name was John, and he was subjected to an impotence test by the church. This goes back to a medieval custom that you could have your marriage annulled if things weren't working in the bedroom on the grounds of annulment. Because the church is like, well, that's what marriage is for, right? It's to produce and procreate, and if things aren't working, then you can have it annulled. But the church also doesn't like to just hand out annulments. Of
course.
Because if you just didn't like your husband, you could go, sorry, it's not
working.
It's not working for me, and then go off. So they came up with this idea that you had to prove it. How do you prove impotence? So that involved a custom known as congress, where wise matrons of the town would be instructed to try and rouse this poor guy's member to see if the charges of impotence were actually correct. And poor old John from York, he was subject to this by several wise matrons who were told exposed their breasts to him, that rubbed him very greatly, and eventually had to declare his member was utterly useless.
Oh, poor John.
Poor John.
I mean, I can't imagine a more unlikely situation in which you could prove that things were working.
I know, right? The pressure.
The threat of divorce, a bunch of women you barely know, and you absolutely have to perform in that moment. And now here we are, 800 years later, still making fun of John.
Laughing about John. Oh, John.
Oh, John. Oh.
Despite what the church wanted and told people, sex was happening in a variety of ways in the medieval period. Accounts from the time can also tell us a little bit about medieval people's attitudes surrounding gender and sexuality. There was a particularly interesting case in 14th century London, where there were strict laws on where sex workers could carry out their trade.
In 1394, a woman named Eleanor Reichner, a sex worker, is caught up on Cheapside with a client named John Bickley. They're in trouble because they are having sex in the wrong place inside of London city walls. As Eleanor is asked to testify, she says that she ordinarily sees clients here around the Tower of London instead.
But the court record reveals something interesting about Eleanor.
She had originally been called John Reichner at birth, but had been living as a woman for years now. And she primarily worked in commercial sex, both in London and also for a time in Oxfordshire. She knew about the ins and outs of commercial sex because that's how she made her living. And it wasn't really a problem that she was what we would call trans, or that she was a sex worker. The only thing she was in trouble for was having sex in the wrong place. If she went back to work here by the tower, technically it would be fine. It's only a matter of record with the courts because of where she was having sex. We don't know exactly what happened to Eleanor as a result of all of this, but her story is proof that what we would call queer people now existed in medieval London just as much as they do today, and they were having sex.
To our way of thinking, sex in the medieval period for the everyday person wasn't exactly a relaxing affair. If you weren't out in the open, you were in a cramped and often crowded communal room. But what if you were lucky enough to be from the upper classes of society? Well, in the Tower of London, we have a fantastic recreation of a bedroom to give us an idea of what the private, or not so private, lives of the royalty were like.
This is one of the finest medieval bedrooms that you were ever likely to see because it is fit for a king. King Edward I, more specifically, who ordered this bedroom built in 1280. It's been redecorated based on manuscript evidence and what we think it might have looked like. Even now, we associate four-poster beds like this with romance and, well, sex. This is an extraordinarily fine example. It's based off of descriptions made for King Edward I. It's a royal bed. So this is as fine as it's possible for a bed to be. Kings would get themselves beds like this, hugely extravagant objects, not just because they were beautiful, but because they afforded them privacy. In a king's bedchamber like this, you wouldn't just expect to find the king and queen. There would often be servants, courtiers going in and out. It would be a throughway. So if you wanted to actually have sex and you wanted some privacy, you'd close these curtains and give yourself some extra space. However, rich people of all types are going to want beds like this if they can afford them. It's just this is the finest example of a medieval bed you're ever likely to see. So how crowded was a royal bedchamber likely to be? Well, it was probably at its max capacity during something called the bedding ceremony that would happen on a royal wedding night. Bedding ceremonies vary across Europe and across time in the medieval period, but in England there were some specifics to it. The first thing that would happen was a priest would come and bless the bed. After that, there would be a big party while the king and queen got into their pajamas and enjoyed some spiced wine. After that, the groomsman and bridesmaid would put them into the bed and begin throwing stockings at each other. There was a reason for this. Apparently, if you hit the king or queen with your stocking, that meant that you would be the next person to marry. After all of this rowdiness, then the king and queen would, in theory, close the bed curtains and get down to consummating the marriage, which is absolutely essential for a marriage to be considered legitimate. So why are so many people involved in the bedding ceremony, and why do they care if the king and queen are having sex? Well, this is the only way that marriage exists. It's for having heirs and having sex. No sex, no marriage. They absolutely have to have sex on their wedding night in order for the marriage to be legal. This is also a matter of importance for the dynasty as a whole, and every courtier has an interest in that. No kids, no dynasty. That's why you get married. So it might not be the most romantic thing in the world, but it is something that the court's involved in. Your royal sex life. If trying to have sex after the bedding ceremony doesn't sound like a lot of fun to you, that's because royal sex wasn't supposed to be fun. You know what was fun? Courtly love. Courtly love, when we say the word, conjures up ideas of romance, and that's certainly true, but it's a kind of romance that isn't very modern at all. That's because it takes place almost exclusively between married women and the unmarried men in the court's retinue. Unmarried men would write love songs, they would write poetry, they would do anything in theory for the woman of their dreams. And part of that was finding ways to have sex that wouldn't endanger their marriages. So the payoff of courtly love is usually non-procreative types of sex, not in beds, not with your husband, anywhere at court that you can snatch a moment of time. There's a real worry within courtly love literature specifically about endangering your heirs and endangering the line of succession. Therefore, there's also warnings about having procreative sex with the person that you're in love with. For example, in Arthuriana, Guinevere and Lancelot accidentally bring down Camelot when they have procreative sex. Whether or not people actually listen to these warnings is not something that we can actually tell. No one tends to write down, yeah, I had adulterous sex last night. However, we do know that there is some kind of tension there, and there are lines that are being drawn and redrawn all the time about what is acceptable and romantic. So we tend to think about medieval people as being real prudes. However, they're interested in all kinds of sex and romance that we would find completely unacceptable. Even at court, in one of the most important places in England, you'll see people that are breaking rules that we think are written in stone. Doesn't matter what the church thinks. Doesn't matter what even Arthurian literature thinks. People are going to find a way to have some fun with each other one way or another. And usually it means that they're not feeling particularly romantic about their husband or wife when they do it.
If courtly love stories offered a refined way to talk about sex and sexuality, at the other end of the spectrum were all sorts of bawdy and lewd tales that would really offend our own sensibilities. However, these sorts of smut had an almost universal appeal in the medieval period, and individuals from all walks of life would compete to tell lusty puns, dirty stories, and all kinds of jokes in places such as banquets. But first, we need to dress the part. Ta-da!
The banqueting hall it's not just somewhere that you come to get your food. It's kind of the epicenter of the house, the epicenter of culture. There'd be musicians, there might be dances happening, and the one thing that they loved is a story. You had your fair share of real highbrow stuff, courtly love, knights, damsels, and all of that stuff. But there's absolutely no doubt that the medieval people loved a smutty story.
And this is the thing. So, you could be in the richest situation in the world and you're still going to hear something like, for example, Chaucer. One of my favorite stories is The Miller's Tale. Within that, you have someone who, she's married to an older man, and she convinces him that a giant flood has come in order to have sex with their lodger who lives in the house. And it's really, really involved. And then it ends with a fart joke.
Yes, it does. It's a really convoluted, farce, basically, of a young woman trying to have sex with someone who isn't her husband, and then there's another suitor on the scene who's wooing her, and he tries to get her attention by singing under her window while she's in bed with another man, and she thinks it's really funny, so she opens the window and she basically sticks her ass out and says, kiss this, and he does. The whole joke is the fact that that he kind of leaps back and goes, oh my god, women don't have beards, and that's just hilarious to all the medieval people.
Chaucer does come from a highbrow context. He is kind of a noble. So, this is the sort of conversation that you could expect to have at table. But we don't expect that. And I suppose what it kind of really tells us is that the history of sex and the kind of pleasure of that is not this big straight line forward into being more and more comfortable about sex. Because actually, in a lot of ways, we've come really far backward from being able to have those sorts of conversations openly.
Yeah, we're better. We are more open than perhaps our grandparents were, but in many ways, we're not open like the medieval people were. We don't have public communal bathing. We don't have sex in the same room as other people. We don't go to a highbrow dinner party and tell pubic hair jokes.
Maybe you don't.
Well, maybe you don't, but it's a pretty sure way not to get invited back pretty quick. But this is the equivalent of having dinner with, the creme de la creme of society, and you're sitting around, making jokes about asses and sex, and I would have loved it, but it's like a strange thing to be doing in this kind of really highbrow situation. But yeah, they loved it. It was just part of their humor and their worldview.
So, okay, over this episode, we have established that medieval people really quite randy. Whether that's people from a royal household having sex in the same room as members of their household, whether that is being totally comfortable with pretty raunchy names for streets, totally accepting sex work, or even having sex in public. Because I have got a great poem for you. It is called The Maidservant's Holiday. It's from the 15th century, and it goes thusly. Jack will pay my share on Sunday at the ale fest. Jack will souse well my throat every good holiday. Soon he will take me by the hand, and he will lay me out on the ground so that my buttocks are in the dirt. Upon this high holiday. In he thrust, and out he drew, and ever I lay beneath him. So, I think, other than being quite funny, what this poem also makes really clear is that medieval people really like to mix their pleasures. Sex, that goes with booze. On that note, our next episode is going to be all about alcohol.
Cheers.
If, like me, you're craving a stiff drink after all that smut, you're in luck. In our next episode, we'll be filling your tankard to the brim with every tipple from the Middle Ages. From the Brewsters and pubs of the peasantry to the royal cellars at Hampton Court, I'll even be heading to Wildcard Brewery to try a real medieval beer.
Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel. Hope you enjoyed that video.
And if you'd like to see more videos where we attempt to try and bring history to life, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell.
Cheers guys, see you soon.